Hello everyone. Before we get started, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. That way, YouTube knows to keep sharing more stories like this with you. Now, let's jump in. It was late October of 2013, and the air in Harlan County already carried that damp, earthy chill that clings to your clothes after sundown. My cousin and I had taken a long weekend to camp and fish along the creeks that ran near Highway 421, not too far from Cranks Creek Lake. We were both in our mid-20s then, restless and tired of town noise, just wanting quiet woods and the sound of running water. We found a small clearing off an old logging road that led down toward a narrow creek. The banks were lined with sycamores, and the water ran cold and clear over round stones. You could smell the wet leaves and mud even from the road. When we parked the truck, the air was still, and the only sounds were a few woodpeckers and the crunch of our boots through the leaf litter. The place felt isolated, like nobody had stepped foot there in years. The closest house we'd passed was a trailer a few miles back, half collapsed and covered in vines. We set up camp not far from the water, just a few feet from a thin game trail that led deeper into the trees. The ground was soft but not soaked, good enough for the tent. It took us maybe an hour to set everything up. Tent, fire ring, folding chairs, cooler. It was still daylight when we decided to follow the creek downstream, just exploring before dark. About 100 yards from where we'd pitched camp, we saw something that made us both stop. It wasn't exactly a cabin, not even a full structure, more like the remains of one. A shack, maybe 8 feet wide and 10 feet long, half collapsed under a tin roof that was held up by 2 walls and a few leaning beams. The walls were gray wood, the kind that had been bleached and warped by rain and years of sun. Inside was a small cast-iron wood stove sitting on uneven stones. What struck me most was that it wasn't cold. When I leaned close, I could feel faint warmth radiating from it. Someone had used it recently, maybe even that morning. There were boot prints in the dirt near the doorway, but they were smudged and hard to read. No fresh tracks leading in or out that I could see. Just a mess of old ones that might have been there for days. My cousin kicked at an old metal pail by the wall, and it rattled loud against the wood. We both looked around, half expecting someone to yell from the trees. Nothing, just the rustle of a crow landing nearby. The shack gave off a strange feeling, not evil or anything, just wrong. Like it was part of the woods but didn't belong there anymore. We figured maybe a hunter used it as a blind or a local drifter slept there sometimes. Harlan County had plenty of people living rough in those hills. The wood stove being warm meant someone had been there, but we told ourselves they'd moved on. It didn't seem like a big deal then. We went back to camp before sunset, started a small fire, and cooked a couple cans of chili on the grate. The night fell quick and heavy once the fire burned down to embers. Out there's no glow from towns, no headlights through the trees, just total darkness and the steady noise of the creek. I remember lying in the tent, listening to it. The sound of water running over stones is peaceful at first, but after a few hours it gets inside your head. Every gurgle sounds like a footstep, every splash like something shifting its weight in the shallows. Around midnight, the fire had gone out completely, and the woods had turned colder. The kind of cold that makes you pull your sleeping bag tight and breathe into it. I must have drifted in and out for a while because when I opened my eyes again, the world was quiet except for the creek. Then came the sound that woke my cousin too, water splashing. Not a random noise, not a raccoon or a fish. It was the rhythm of footsteps, slow, deliberate steps moving through the water, one after another. I could tell from the sound that whoever, or whatever it was, they were walking downstream, toward where we'd found the shack. The splashes would stop, then start again, steady as breathing. It wasn't close enough to see, but close enough that the sound carried clean through the still air. Neither of us said a word. We just listened, frozen, waiting for it to stop. Then came another sound, a low scraping like something being dragged through gravel. You could hear the weight in it. The drag wasn't smooth. It hit rocks and paused, then continued. I remember feeling that cold sweat on my back, the kind that comes when your body knows something isn't right. The dragging sound lasted maybe a minute, maybe longer, then silence again. The creek went back to its regular rhythm, and the woods around us stayed dead quiet. I didn't hear any twigs snap, no footsteps leaving, no truck starting, just that silence that makes your heart beat louder than your thoughts. I don't know how long we lay there before we fell back asleep, if we even did. My mind just kept circling the same thought. What was heavy enough to make that sound? And why was someone moving through the creek at 2 in the morning? When the first light started coming through the tent, I crawled out. The air had that foggy, pale blue look of early morning, and everything was wet with dew. My cousin was already up, standing near the bank. He looked pale, staring down at the stones. When I walked over, I saw it too. A long, smeared drag mark running from the direction of the shack straight toward the river. It cut through the gravel like something heavy had been pulled by hand. The mark was still wet, darker than the surrounding stones. You could see faint boot prints beside it, but only for a few feet before they vanished into the water. The trail stopped right at the edge of the creek. There was no sign of whatever had been dragged. No tarp, no log, no animal remains, nothing. We followed it back toward the shack. The ground was damp and the air smelled faintly of smoke again. The wood stove door was cracked open, and inside there were blackened bits of charred wood, still faintly warm. Someone had been there that night, after us or maybe before. I checked around the clearing. No bedrolls, no tools, no food wrappers. Nothing that said anyone lived there. Just a few rusted cans and an old bucket half buried in the dirt. My cousin didn't say much. He just kept scanning the trees like he expected someone to step out. We didn't stay long. I remember the way we moved, quiet, fast, barely speaking. We rolled up the sleeping bags, stuffed what we could into our packs. The air felt heavy, like we were being watched even if nothing was there. I kept glancing at the trail leading back to the shack, expecting to see movement. The drag mark through the gravel was still clear when we left, glistening in the pale light. We didn't bother taking the tent poles. They were cheap aluminum ones, and neither of us wanted to waste time folding them. We just yanked the tent stakes out, crammed the fabric into the truck bed, and got the hell out of there. As we drove back up the logging road, I looked in the rearview mirror. The fog was thicker now, rolling low along the creek, swallowing the clearing where we'd camped. The sound of the tires on gravel echoed strangely, like the woods were swallowing that too. We didn't stop until we hit the main highway again. Only then did it really sink in. The warmth of the stove, the footsteps in the creek, the dragging sound, and the wet trail leading into nothing. We talked later about what it could have been. Maybe a hunter moving game at night, maybe someone pulling a deer carcass through the water. But even that didn't sit right. Nobody but a fool would be wading through a freezing creek at 2 in the morning, dragging something that heavy. And the warmth of that stove, it hadn't been dying out. It had been used recently, like someone was still there. I've camped plenty since then, different states, different seasons. But that night in Harlan County never left my head. Sometimes I'll wake in the middle of the night to the sound of running water. And for a moment, I'm back in that tent again, waiting for the splash of footsteps and that slow scrape through the gravel to start all over. Whatever was dragged into that river, it's still there somewhere beneath the water, and I'll never know what or who it was. After a week of hard rain, the kind that turns gravel roads into rivers and creeks into brown walls of rushing water, I decided to head out to Fires Creek. I'd been stuck inside for days listening to the roof drip and the thunder roll over the mountains. When the sun finally came out that morning, I loaded my kayak onto the back of my truck and drove down toward the lower valley where the floodwater had pooled. Fires Creek usually ran low this time of year, clear enough to see trout flashing between rocks, but now it had swallowed the banks and spread far into the trees. The water was a thick brown color, the kind that hides everything beneath it. Roots, wire, even fences. I could smell wet earth and rotting leaves the moment I got out of the truck. The air was humid and still, and the only sounds were dripping branches and the faint hiss of runoff sliding downhill. I pushed off into the flooded flats, using my paddle to steer between submerged bushes and bits of wood. The current wasn't bad where I was, more of a slow drift, but I could feel the power of it underneath. The forest looked strange, half underwater, trees rising straight from the brown mirror, their lower trunks lost beneath the surface. Every now and then I passed a fence post sticking up or a floating tire, small reminders that this had been pasture not long ago. About half a mile in, I saw it through the trees, a small white church standing in the water. I'd been around this area a few times before, but I didn't remember any building being there. It looked old, with paint peeling off the siding and vines crawling up the walls. The steeple leaned slightly to one side, and the front doors were open, just wide enough for me to see dark water sloshing inside. The sight of it gave me a weird feeling, but curiosity kept me paddling closer. The flood had come up nearly halfway on the building, almost reaching the bottom of the windows. The sun caught on the white paint, making it glare against the muddy backdrop. I circled around the side, trying to figure out how deep it might be inside. The windows were broken in some places, and water rippled in and out through them with each small breeze. When I reached the front, I could see right into the main room through the open doors. The pews inside were tilted at odd angles, some half floating, others wedged sideways. A few hymnals drifted along the surface, their pages puffed out and dark from soaking. The pulpit stood just above the waterline, and on the wall behind it I noticed something strange. The white paint had been scraped down to bare wood in large, rough letters. The word said, "No one left." I don't know why, but reading that made the back of my neck prickle. The letters were uneven, like someone had carved them in a hurry. I sat there in my kayak for a while, staring at it, listening to the slow creaks of wood swelling with water. The smell hit me after that, a sour, thick stench like something decaying. It burned in my nose and throat. I almost gagged. That's when I felt something thump under my kayak. Just a dull, heavy hit from below, enough to rock me a little. I froze, then leaned forward trying to see through the water, but it was too dark. Then it happened again, another hit, harder this time, right beneath me. The kayak jolted. I paddled backward fast, keeping my balance as best I could. The surface rippled, and a trail of small bubbles started rising where the hits had come from. I didn't stay to see what it was. I backed out from the church and turned the kayak toward higher ground, paddling hard until I reached a cluster of trees where the water thinned out. When I looked back, I saw the bubbles still breaking the surface near the church doors, drifting slowly toward the shore, like something moving under there. I didn't look back again after that. The smell followed me for a while. Even when I got back to the truck and strapped the kayak down, I could still taste it in the air. I drove home without saying anything to anyone about it. I didn't know what to make of what I'd seen. I figured maybe the flood had loosened a septic tank or drowned an animal inside the church. It wasn't impossible. Old buildings around here sometimes sat half on old cemeteries too. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about those words on the wall, "No one left," and the way the bubbles had followed me. I even dreamed about the church leaning in the brown water, the letters glowing pale under the surface like they'd sunk down with the building. The next morning, I decided to go back. I told a friend of mine, Eric, about it, and he offered to come along. He thought it sounded interesting, maybe even worth taking some photos. The rain had held off, and the air was clearer that day, but the water was still high. We followed the same dirt road until it ended at the flooded fields. I pointed to where the church had been visible before, just past a cluster of poplars, but it wasn't there. The water stretched out smooth and flat, reflecting the gray sky. The trees were still half submerged, the same fence post sticking up where I'd turned around the day before, but no sign of the church. I thought maybe I had drifted off course the first time, so we paddled farther in, checking from different angles. We even tried to line up landmarks like the big elm and the edge of the hill behind it. But there was nothing, no roof, no steeple, not even debris. If a building that size had collapsed, there would have been boards, shingles, something. The water was still. No current strong enough to carry it far. I checked the GPS on my phone against yesterday's route, and it put us right in the same spot. Still nothing. We sat there for a while, both of us quiet, listening. The only sound was the slow drip of water from tree branches. The surface didn't even ripple, not like before. I dipped my paddle in a few times, pushing it down to feel the depth. The mud bottom was there, maybe 8 feet down, solid. I thought about diving to see if anything remained, but the water was too murky, and the smell, fainter now but still there, made me hesitate. It didn't make sense that a whole building could just vanish overnight. The flood wasn't receding fast enough for it to be buried, and there was no drag path or wreckage floating downstream. It looked like the place had never existed. We stayed another half hour, drifting in silence before heading back. I didn't talk much on the drive home. I kept thinking about the lettering on that wall, about the smell, about those bubbles that had followed me. I tried to reason it out. Maybe the building had been an old shed or chapel that collapsed entirely under the waterline during the night. Maybe the mud swallowed it, the way sinkholes sometimes opened after floods. But the thing that stuck with me wasn't the missing church. It was that sound under the kayak, heavy, slow, like something solid brushing just below. I knew it wasn't a log. I'd been on the water long enough to tell the difference. There had been a pulse to it, something that moved with intent. Weeks later, when the flood finally went down, I went back one more time. The valley floor was exposed again, cracked and streaked with silt. Trees lay sideways, their roots bare. I walked the same path I'd paddled before, stepping through dried mud where the church had been. There was nothing there. No foundation, no boards, no nails, not even a stone. Just an uneven patch of ground, slightly sunken, with a faint chemical odor still clinging to it. Farther down, near the edge of the creek, I saw a row of bubbles breaking quietly in a puddle where the water still lingered. They rose one at a time, small and steady, from deep beneath the surface. I stood there watching until they stopped. Then I turned around and left the valley behind, not looking back. I never saw the church again. Sometimes when I drive past Fires Creek after a storm, I glance down toward the lowlands. The trees always look a little different after each flood. The ground shifting, old things surfacing and vanishing again. It's easy to forget what used to be there. Maybe that's why someone carved those words into the wall. Maybe whoever stayed last understood something about this place. That when the water comes, it doesn't just take things away. It erases them. I camped alone on Cold Mountain in late November of 2017, right before the snow came in heavy that year. It was the kind of cold that made your breath hang in front of your face like smoke, even during the day. The temperature had dropped to the high 20s by nightfall, and the whole Shining Rock wilderness was empty. I didn't see a single car on the gravel road as I made my way up. The forest felt hollow, like it had already gone to sleep for the season. The leaves were gone, the creeks ran thin and dark, and the air had that dry, metallic taste that only comes when it's below freezing. I'd hiked Cold Mountain a few times before, always with friends, but that weekend I wanted the quiet. I parked my car at the trailhead and started late in the afternoon, knowing I'd make camp near the summit before dark. The trail was rough, steep, scattered with frost and fallen branches. My pack felt heavier with each step. By the time I reached the top, the sun was low, bleeding orange light through the thin line of clouds over the ridges. I could see miles of rolling blue-gray peaks fading into the distance. There was no sign of anyone else. No voices, no movement, nothing. I found a flat spot just below the summit, a few hundred feet from where the trail curved toward a rocky overlook. It was sheltered on one side by boulders and on the other by a line of scrub trees. I stomped down a patch of frozen soil to set up my tent, then started a small fire in a ring of stones someone had left behind from the summer season. The wood was damp and stubborn, and the fire barely gave off enough heat to keep my hands from stiffening. By the time I finished dinner, a freeze-dried meal I barely managed to warm up, The light was gone. The wind picked up fast, rolling down from the ridge in cold, steady bursts. I put out the fire and crawled into my sleeping bag with my headlamp off, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. The silence was huge. Then, somewhere far off in the valley, I heard the first coyote calls. At first it was just one or two, sharp and distant. Then a whole chorus picked up, rising and falling in long echoes. I'd heard coyotes plenty of times before, but that night their cries sounded closer, like they were weaving through the valleys and ridges, pushing the sound up toward me. The wind made it hard to tell where they were. Sometimes it seemed like they were right below the slope, other times a mile away. I told myself it was nothing unusual. Animals were active at night, and I was deep in their territory. But after midnight, things changed. I woke up to a single sound, a howl, long, low, drawn out, and completely unlike the others. It started like a coyote, thin and quivering, but it didn't taper off the way their calls usually do. It deepened at the end, almost like a moan, and then flattened into something that sounded disturbingly close to a word. Not a real word, but the shape of one. The kind of sound a person might make trying to mimic an animal and failing. It came from somewhere above the ridge, maybe 100 yards away. I lay still inside my sleeping bag, staring at the faint curve of the tent ceiling lit by moonlight. My heartbeat thudded so loud I could hear it in my ears. I waited for another sound, but the forest had gone dead quiet again. Even the wind seemed to pause. Minutes passed, or maybe an hour, I couldn't tell. The next thing I remember is the crunch of footsteps. They started faint, down near where the slope dropped off, and moved slowly uphill. Each step broke the frozen crust of the soil, that distinct dry snap you hear when the ground is hard with frost. The steps were steady, deliberate, not like an animal nosing around in the dark. I could follow them circling around the tent, one slow loop after another, pausing every few seconds. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. My body felt like it had turned to stone. I could see the shadow of the tent fabric shift as something, or someone, moved just outside. Then the steps came closer until I could tell exactly where they stopped. Right by my head, just inches from where I was lying. I could hear the faint creak of weight shifting, the grind of a boot or a heel pressing into the soil. For a few seconds there was nothing but the wind again. Then the sound of breathing, slow, almost calm. I don't remember ever being that still in my life. I just stared into the dark fabric and counted the seconds in my head, waiting for something, a hand, a voice, a sound, but nothing came. Eventually, the steps started again, circling once more, then fading away toward the slope. I lay there for the rest of the night, staring at the faint gray outline of my tent, too scared to even reach for the knife in my pack. When dawn finally came, the light hit the tent in a pale yellow glow. My entire body ached from staying frozen in one position for hours. I unzipped the tent flap slowly, expecting to see nothing, but the ground outside was covered in a light frost that made everything clear. There were footprints, 2 sets. One was from boots, medium-sized, tread pattern faint but visible, walking in wide circles around my tent. The other was barefoot, bare feet pressed deep into frozen ground, clear enough to see the shape of the toes. They looked wrong, too wide, the arch flattened. The toes slightly spread like whoever made them had walked that way for a long time. Both sets led away from my tent toward the slope where the trail dropped down through the rocks. Then they just stopped. Not faded, not turned. Just ended where the frozen dirt gave way to stone. I followed them a short distance, scanning the ridge for movement. But there was nothing. No tracks beyond that point. No sign of anyone else on the mountain. The forest was silent again, except for the faint crackle of ice melting on the trees as the sun rose higher. I packed up faster than I ever have before. My fingers shook so badly I dropped my stove twice trying to get it back into my pack. Every sound, every branch creak, every gust of wind made my stomach twist. When I finally started down the trail, I kept checking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing back at the campsite watching me leave. The hike down took less than 2 hours. I barely noticed the cold or the slope, just kept walking until the trees thinned and the gravel road came into view. My car was still there, alone in the lot. No tire tracks, no other vehicles. Not even footprints on the frost-covered ground, except for mine from the day before. I threw my pack in the back seat and sat behind the wheel for a long time before starting the engine. The whole way down the mountain road, I kept replaying the sound of that howl, that long, drawn-out noise that had sounded almost like a word. When I got home that evening, I checked the weather reports, trail logs, anything I could find. There hadn't been any other hikers registered in the Shining Rock area that weekend. Rangers reported no human activity up there since early November. For a few weeks after, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the barefoot prints were distorted boot tracks. Maybe the howl was some strange echo of the wind. But every time I think about how close those steps came to my head, how they stopped and stood there in the dark while I lay awake pretending to sleep, those explanations fall apart. I've gone backpacking all over since then, Virginia, Tennessee, out west. But I've never gone back to Cold Mountain. And I never camp alone anymore. Not because of coyotes or the cold or even the fear itself. It's because somewhere on that ridge, high above the frozen valleys, someone else was walking barefoot through the frost that night. And I still don't know why. I was working on a mapping project near Elkmont, Tennessee, late that fall. The goal was to trace some of the old mining trails that had been reclaimed by the forest. Most were faint cuts through the undergrowth, overgrown with laurel and slick with moss, but some still showed signs of the old days. Rusted rails, collapsed timbers, and once in a while, holes in the ground that used to lead somewhere deeper. I'd been out there for about 3 days already, alone, marking coordinates and noting landmarks for a survey report. The air smelled of wet leaves and iron-rich soil, and every surface was slick with dew that never really dried under the tree canopy. That afternoon, I was moving along a narrow slope lined with hemlocks when I noticed a patch of ground that looked different, flattened, like something had once been dragged over it. When I pushed aside some fallen branches and brush, I saw a small hole in the hillside. It wasn't big, maybe 3 feet high at the mouth, but deep enough that it swallowed the beam of my headlamp. The edges were lined with old timbers that had rotted down to soft, crumbly wood. The smell coming from inside was sharp and strange, metallic, almost like blood, mixed with something animal, wet fur, and decay. I knew I shouldn't go in, not alone, but curiosity got the better of me. I dropped my pack at the entrance and crouched down, ducking under the low ceiling. The air was cooler inside, still and heavy, like a cellar that hadn't been opened in years. The sound of my boots on the damp ground was muffled. My breath echoed faintly. About 40 feet in, just as I was about to turn back, the light from my headlamp caught something unnatural, a bright white point against the dark. I froze, thinking it was maybe another person's light, but it didn't move. I took a few steps closer, slow and careful, and realized it was a small LED work light sitting neatly on a flat rock. The casing was covered in grime and dust, but it was still glowing faintly, like it had just been turned on. I knelt to get a better look and picked it up. It was one of those lights that usually take a pair of AA batteries. I turned it over and the battery door was open, empty. No corrosion, no old batteries, nothing. I stared at it for a while, not sure what to make of it. The light itself wasn't bright enough to illuminate much beyond the rock it sat on, but it was steady, no flicker. I set it back down the same way I'd found it, feeling uneasy. The smell inside the cave seemed stronger now, like old blood and something damp that had been left to rot. I backed away slowly, my headlamp beam shaking a little as I tried not to slip on the wet ground. When I finally stepped out into the daylight again, I took a long breath, trying to shake the feeling that I'd walked into someone else's space. I turned to look back once more, just to be sure I hadn't imagined it. The inside was pitch black, no sign of the LED light at all, just darkness. I stood there for a long minute, trying to convince myself that maybe my eyes had adjusted weirdly, or maybe the angle had changed. Still, the feeling stayed with me all the way back down the slope, a deep unease that didn't let go. That evening I made camp near the trailhead, about half a mile from where I'd found the cave. It was a small flat spot beside an old fire ring, not far from the creek. I set up my tent, cooked a quick meal of rice and beans on my camp stove, and packed all my food into the bear canister like I always did. I'd been camping solo for years, and the routine usually made me feel grounded. But that night everything felt slightly off. The forest around me was too quiet. No owls, no frogs, not even the distant rush of wind through trees, just the soft dripping of water from the branches above. I climbed into my sleeping bag and read over my notes by the glow of my headlamp, trying to distract myself. At some point I must have dozed off because when I woke, the forest outside was pitch black. My watch said 2:17 a.m. I lay there listening. At first, there was nothing but the faint creak of the trees and the occasional plop of water hitting my tent. Then I heard it, a light metallic tap. It came from just a few feet away where I'd stashed the bear canister. I thought maybe it was a small animal nosing around, a raccoon or something. But the sound wasn't random. It was spaced out, steady. Tick, tick, tick. I unzipped the tent halfway and aimed my headlamp toward the canister. The beam caught the dull gleam of the metal lid. Nothing was there. The forest looked empty. I waited, then zipped the flap closed again, telling myself it was probably just water dripping from a branch. A few minutes later, the tapping started again. Same pace, same tone. It sounded almost deliberate, like someone gently knocking on the lid with a rock or a stick. Tick, tick, tick. I lay still, barely breathing. Every few minutes it would stop, then start again. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. My mind kept flashing back to the cave, the smell, the empty light, the way it had just disappeared. By 4 a.m., I hadn't slept at all. I finally decided to step out and check. The air was cold and smelled of wet earth. I moved the headlamp beam slowly across the clearing. The canister was exactly where I'd left it. No tracks, no signs of animals. The ground was soft mud. I would have seen prints if anything had come close. I picked up the canister. It was damp with condensation, but otherwise fine. No scratches, no marks. I set it back down, making sure the lid was tight, and crawled back into the tent. The tapping didn't start again after that, but I didn't really sleep either. I just lay there, watching the faint shapes of the trees through the nylon until dawn. When I got up, the forest looked normal again. Gray mist hanging between the trunks, birds calling somewhere high up, everything washed clean by the dew. I packed up camp fast, faster than usual. Before leaving, I walked once more toward the trail leading to the cave, but stopped about halfway. I couldn't bring myself to go near it again. The air down that path felt colder somehow, heavier. Back in town later that day, I mentioned the cave to a ranger at the visitor center while I was signing out my permit. He said there were dozens of small mine shafts and exploratory cuts around Elkmont, some from the early 1900s, some never officially recorded. A few had been sealed, others just collapsed naturally. He warned me not to go poking around in them, said they were dangerous, especially this time of year when the ground was unstable from all the rain. I didn't mention the light or the tapping. I didn't want to hear a rational explanation that wouldn't make me feel any better. That night, in my motel room, I dumped out my pack to check everything before heading home. My gear was normal: maps, compass, GPS, headlamp, extra batteries. But at the bottom of the bag, stuck in the corner under my rain cover, was a faint smear of reddish mud. It smelled faintly metallic, like iron and something else I couldn't quite name. I washed the bag out in the sink and didn't think much more about it. A few weeks later, I mailed in my survey report and forgot about the whole thing for a while. But every so often, when I'm camping alone and the woods get too quiet, I think about that faint tapping and the glow of that batteryless light deep underground. I can't explain it. Maybe it was a trick of my eyes. Maybe the tapping was just branches settling. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I still see that tiny LED lamp sitting on that rock, glowing just enough to show that something, or someone, had been there before me. I was bow hunting alone in the Lewis and Clark National Forest, somewhere near the Belt Mountains in Montana. It was mid-October, the air cold enough to see your breath but still bearable if you kept moving. I had parked my truck off an old logging road that hadn't seen a grader in years, then hiked about 5 miles in with my gear. My plan was simple: stay out until dark, set up camp nearby, and hunt again at first light. I'd done solo hunts before, but something about that part of the forest already felt different the moment I stepped out of the truck. It was quieter. Even the wind through the pines seemed to move slower, muffled somehow. By late afternoon, I'd found a small rise that overlooked a draw leading to a stream, perfect for deer movement. I'd been sitting there in my camo, back against a pine, for about an hour when I first noticed it. Just a faint rustling somewhere behind me. It wasn't loud, just the kind of noise that makes your brain pause in the middle of its thoughts. I figured it might be a squirrel, or maybe a deer circling around with the wind changing direction. I turned my head slowly, scanning through the branches behind me. That's when I saw her. She was about 40 yards back, standing perfectly still between 2 trees. At first, I thought it was another hunter. She was wearing full camouflage head to toe. Even her face looked smudged with something dark. But there was no pack, no weapon, nothing in her hands. Just her, standing there. The light was starting to dim, that late golden hour glow filtering through the trees. It hit her just enough to make the pattern of her camo blend into the shadows, so I had to squint to be sure she was even real. Then she lifted her arm and waved once, slow. Not a big friendly wave, more like a stiff motion, her hand barely moving. I froze for a second. It was such a strange thing to see out here this far in, but I didn't want to be rude or spook her, so I raised my hand and gave a small wave back. She didn't move after that, just stood there. I waited, trying to figure out if she was lost or maybe waiting for someone else. But the longer I looked, the less sense it made. The forest was dead quiet again. When I finally turned back around, my heart was still beating fast. I stayed in my spot another 10 minutes trying to calm down, but I couldn't focus on hunting anymore. I kept checking over my shoulder. After a while, I decided to pack up. The sun was starting to dip behind the ridge, and I wanted to check out where she'd been standing before heading back toward camp. I followed the spot where I'd seen her, pushing through brush that caught on my sleeves. The ground was covered in pine needles and soft enough to show prints. I expected to see boot tracks, but what I found stopped me cold. Bare footprints. They were small, narrow. The toes pressed deep like someone had walked with purpose. The prints led from the direction of the deeper woods straight to the spot she'd stood, then continued past it. That's when I noticed the clearing. It wasn't big, maybe 20 feet across, open enough to let in a bit of the fading light. On the far side of it was a single pine tree, older than the rest, with 3 deer skulls nailed to its trunk. The nails were rusted but solid, and the skulls were arranged in a perfect triangle, 2 at eye level, 1 just below between them. Each skull was stripped clean, polished by weather and time. There was something deliberate about the symmetry. I just stood there staring, not sure if I should be creeped out or curious. I remember the smell too. Damp earth mixed with something faintly sour like old blood and rain. The prints continued past the clearing, heading deeper into the trees, barefoot the entire way. I crouched down to look closer, tracing the path with my eyes until the dim light made it impossible to see further. That was enough for me. I turned around and started back toward where I'd left my gear. The woods felt heavier now, every little sound amplified. A branch snapped somewhere far off, and I found myself picking up my pace without thinking about it. I kept glancing behind me, half expecting to see that camouflaged figure again, standing between the trees. By the time I reached the spot I'd been sitting earlier, the sun was gone. The forest went dark fast, the kind of darkness that swallows everything. My flashlight beam cut a narrow path through the black, catching bits of fog that had started to creep in from the draw below. I packed my bow and strapped my things down as fast as I could. I had planned to camp, but that idea was gone now. I just wanted out. The hike back to my truck was a long one. 5 miles doesn't sound like much until it's pitch dark. the trail winding through thick timber and uneven ground. Every sound made me stop. Once I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing. Just the dark. Another time I caught the smell again, the same faint sour scent from the clearing. Lingered for a moment, then vanished. I started walking faster. My flashlight beam caught eyes once, just a deer off to the side, but it made my chest tighten anyway. The night felt wrong. It wasn't just fear, it was something deeper, like the forest itself was holding its breath. At one point I thought about setting up camp halfway back, but the idea of stopping made my skin crawl. So I just kept moving, one step after another, focusing on the path. My legs burned, and my shoulders ached from the pack, but I didn't slow down. The trail seemed longer than it had in the morning, twisting and climbing in ways I didn't remember. When I finally reached the old logging road, my truck was just a dark shape against the tree line. I didn't even take my pack off before unlocking the door and throwing everything inside. I sat there for a long minute, engine off, just listening. The forest was quiet again, not even the sound of crickets now. Then I turned the key and started driving. The road out was rough, and the headlights caught the trees whipping past on both sides. About half a mile from where I'd parked, I slowed down. There was a figure standing by the side of the road. For a split second, I thought it was her again. The same outline, the same stillness. But when I got closer, it was just an old stump, shaped by shadows. I didn't stop after that. I reached the highway around midnight. The whole drive back to town. My mind replayed what I'd seen, the wave, the skulls, the barefoot tracks. I tried to make sense of it, but nothing fit. Maybe she was some kind of hermit living off the grid. Or maybe it was just a messed up backwoods ritual I wasn't supposed to see. I'll never know. The next day, I thought about going back, maybe with someone else, just to make sure I hadn't imagined it. But the more I thought about that clearing, the more certain I became that I didn't want to see it again. I've hunted a lot of places since then, but never that far out alone again. Even now, whenever I'm deep in the woods and the light starts to fade, I catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there. Silent, waving slow, just watching. I was part of a small survey crew hired by the state to inspect old coal shafts, scattered through the hills west of Beckley, West Virginia. Most of them hadn't been touched since the 1980s, long after the last companies packed up and left. The goal was to assess structural stability and gas buildup, maybe see if any could be safely sealed again. It was early November. Gray skies, cold air, the kind of damp chill that sinks into your bones and never leaves. We'd been working the same ridge for a week, moving from one collapsed entrance to another, marking coordinates, taking air readings, and logging them. It was tedious work but paid well enough. That morning we hiked about a mile down a muddy path that wound through scrub pines and thorn bushes until we reached the mouth of the shaft on our list. The map called it Shaft 12B. The entrance was framed with old timbers blackened with age and streaked with rust from the iron gate welded there decades ago. The gate, though, had mostly given up to corrosion. 2 hinges snapped, the bottom bar half buried in muck. Someone had forced it open long before we arrived. The air around it had that sharp metallic tang I've come to associate with abandoned mines. There's a heaviness in it, like old rock dust and rusted iron mixed with stagnant water. We turned on our headlamps and gas monitors before stepping in. The tunnel sloped downward gently, the ground slick with coal dust and mud. Every step made a soft crunch that echoed strangely far down the passage. I went in second, behind our lead, Mark, and ahead of the other 2, Kyle and Brent. We stayed close, light beams overlapping against the rough walls. The ceiling was maybe 8 feet high at first, dropping lower in some places where beams had sagged, or where rock had flaked off over the years. A few rails from the old cart system still lay half buried in sludge. You could see faint boot marks, but they were old, probably ours from other days. We'd gone maybe 100 yards when I started noticing the air getting thicker. It's something you feel before you even check the meter. Your lungs working harder, that taste of metal on your tongue. The gas monitor gave a slow beep signaling reduced oxygen, not dangerous yet, but enough to keep us alert. That's when Mark's light caught something ahead, bright color in all the black. It was a sleeping bag, unrolled and perfectly laid out on a flat stretch of rock to the right of the tunnel. Next to it was a small butane camping stove, the kind backpackers use. The flame was still faintly glowing, orange and trembling, and beside it an open can of beans, steam still curling from the top. We just froze there for a moment, trying to process what we were seeing. Someone had been down there minutes, maybe seconds before us. The sleeping bag was clean, no dust, no dampness, as if it had just been set out. The can wasn't even blackened from heat. Whoever it was, they couldn't have gotten far. Mark signaled us to hold position and scanned the tunnel deeper with his flashlight. The beam disappeared into the dark beyond where the tunnel bent slightly left. Nothing moved, but the silence was different. Too full, like the air was pressing in around us. We stood there longer than we probably should have. The only sounds were our breathing and the soft hiss of the stove flame. I remember staring at that can of beans, the little bubbles rising to the surface, thinking about how recently someone's hand must have turned that knob. Finally, we decided to head out and report it. We weren't supposed to confront anyone underground. Standard rule for safety. Squatters, drifters, even illegal scavengers sometimes use these places. You never knew what kind of person you'd run into down there. We turned around, careful with our steps, trying not to make too much noise. The tunnel behind us looked smaller than it had coming in, like the walls were closing a little. My light flickered across the old gate in the distance, the weak daylight beyond it. Then I looked down, right beside my last boot print. There was another, same size, same tread pattern, same direction, except it was facing inward, deeper into the mine. The tread was crisp, edges wet with fresh mud, as if it had just been made seconds before. I didn't say anything. None of us did. But I could tell the others saw it too. Mark's headlamp lingered there a beat longer. Then he started moving faster toward the entrance. We followed without speaking. The air felt heavier with every step. The gas monitor beeped again, faster now. I could taste rust in the back of my throat, that weird battery-like flavor. My breathing felt too loud, echoing off the walls. Behind us, somewhere down the tunnel, something made a faint scuffing sound. It wasn't loud, not even sharp, just a drag like someone shifting their weight or brushing against gravel. We didn't turn around. We just kept walking. When we reached the gate, Kyle was the first one out. He pushed through the bent metal and stumbled into daylight, gasping like he'd been underwater. I followed, and the cold November air outside felt like the first real breath I'd taken all morning. We didn't talk on the hike back. Mark radioed the site coordinator from the truck and said we'd found evidence of a possible trespasser and were pulling out. We drove back to the main trailer lot in silence. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under the tires and the occasional click from the air monitor still beeping faintly on the dash. Later that day, a separate team went out with security and local authorities to check the shaft. They found the stove, cold now, and the sleeping bag, but everything else, food cans, pack, footprints, was gone. They said there were no other signs of anyone living down there. No alternate exit either, just the one tunnel, blocked at the far end by a collapse maybe 200 yards in. They concluded whoever it was must have heard us coming, panicked, and somehow slipped out without being seen. But we'd been standing right there. There was only one way out. We would have seen anyone pass us. We didn't argue it, though. No one wanted to go back to prove otherwise. Our crew moved to another section of the ridge the next week, and Shaft 12B got marked for permanent sealing. They welded a new gate in place and covered it with concrete fill. Months later, when the project wrapped up, I drove past the site again out of curiosity. The road had nearly washed out from spring rains, and the hillside was overgrown. The new gate was solid, fresh gray concrete, no gaps. But as I got closer, I noticed something faintly pressed into the wet cement near the bottom. It was a boot print. Same tread as mine, same size, pointing inward. I stood there for a while, just staring at it, my stomach tightening in that same cold way it had inside the shaft. There's no real explanation that makes sense to me. Not one that fits everything I saw. Maybe someone had been living in there and got trapped deeper inside. Maybe it was a prank. Or maybe I just missed something simple in the panic. But every time I think about that place, the metallic taste, the warmth of that can, that silent print beside my own, I can still feel how wrong the air felt down there. We left our equipment in that tunnel. I didn't even bother collecting my bag. They can have it, whoever they were. I don't need any proof. The memory is enough. It was late, close to 10, maybe a bit after, when I started the drive back from Seneca Rocks. The climb down had taken longer than I'd expected, and by the time I got back to my car, the last of the daylight had drained out of the valley. The air was cool and heavy, the kind that holds onto the smell of pine and damp leaves. I wasn't worried about the drive. Route 33 between Seneca Rocks and Franklin isn't bad. Just a stretch of winding mountain road lined with thick forest on both sides. The kind where the trees seem to lean inward, swallowing the edges of your headlights. I'd driven it plenty of times before, but that night felt different. Quieter, heavier somehow. I rolled my windows up, turned off the music, and focused on the road. There weren't any other cars out, which wasn't unusual for that time of night. But the silence outside made it feel like the world had gone still. Even my tires sounded too loud against the pavement. Every turn felt sharper than it should have, and every shadow along the tree line seemed to stretch longer than normal. I remember glancing at my clock, 10:48 p.m., when I came around a bend that curved out toward a short straightaway. That's when I saw it. A car, a silver or gray sedan, was sitting sideways across both lanes up ahead. Its headlights were off, no hazard lights, nothing. It looked like it had been parked that way deliberately, blocking the entire road. For a second I thought maybe it was an accident. Maybe someone had spun out. But even from a distance, something about it didn't look right. There wasn't any sign of damage. The car was just sitting there, perfectly straight, like someone had placed it that way. I slowed down immediately, letting my headlights sweep across the sides of the road. There was no movement, no sign of anyone standing near it. I stopped about 30 feet away and flicked on my high beams. The light hit the car square on, washing out the paint, making it look almost white. The windshield reflected the glare, but through the side windows I could see the seats, empty. No driver, no passengers, not even a shadow of someone ducking down. That's when I noticed how quiet it was. The forest around me, usually alive with the sound of insects at night, was completely silent. No crickets, no frogs, not even the distant hum of wind through the trees. Just the faint ticking of my engine cooling as I sat there in the middle of the road. I kept my hand on the gear shift, not sure if I should get out or back up. I leaned forward, squinting at the car. The driver's door was closed, and all the windows were rolled up. I tried to make out if there was any damage or a flat tire, something that could explain why it was stopped like that, but everything looked intact. Then I saw the shadow of the trees behind it stretch slightly, just enough to make me think something had moved. My first thought was that someone had broken down and walked into the woods for help. But the way the car was parked didn't make sense. It looked intentional, like someone had wanted it to block the road. My gut started to tighten. I didn't want to just sit there. I shifted into reverse, intending to back up and maybe turn around. But before I even touched the gas, I heard something. A soft crunch of gravel or dirt from behind me, so quiet that if the night hadn't been so dead still, I might have missed it. It wasn't loud, just a single footstep, maybe two, right behind the car. Every instinct in me said not to look. I kept my eyes forward, staring at the empty sedan. My hand tightened around the wheel. Then I heard it again, closer this time, another crunch, followed by a faint scrape like the toe of a shoe against the asphalt. I eased my foot onto the brake and shifted fully into reverse, my pulse hammering in my ears. The moment my tires rolled backward and the gravel crunched under them, A flashlight beam cut across my rear window. Quick and sudden, like someone had swept it across deliberately. I didn't think. I floored it. The car jolted backward. Then I yanked the wheel to the right and cut through the shallow ditch that ran alongside the road. Mud and gravel flew up behind me as I tore down the shoulder, bumping over uneven ground until I was back on the pavement. I didn't look back. I just drove, pushing the speed up until the road started to blur in the corners of my vision. The trees flew by in a tunnel of darkness, my headlights bouncing off the reflective signs as I wound down the mountain. I kept expecting to see headlights appear behind me, but the rearview mirror stayed black. Every turn, every straightaway, I checked again. Nothing. By the time I reached the edge of Franklin, the lights of town felt unreal, like I was pulling into a different world. My hands were shaking when I finally slowed down, coasting toward the first gas station I saw. A small one just off the highway, the kind with a single pump island and a flickering canopy light. I pulled into the lot and parked by the side of the building, letting my engine idle while I tried to catch my breath. The air outside was still, and I could hear the faint hum of the station's refrigeration units. I sat there for maybe a minute staring at my dashboard, trying to process what had just happened. My headlights reflected weakly off the glass door of the convenience store, but no one was inside. It was closed for the night. That's when I looked into my mirror. Across the lot, tucked behind the gas station's dumpster, was a car. A silver sedan, the same one. I knew it instantly. The angle of the headlights, the shape of the rear window, it was identical. The engine was running. I could see the faint shimmer of heat above the hood, but there were no lights on. No one was in the driver's seat. The windows were completely dark. For a few seconds, I just sat there, frozen. I could feel the hairs on my arms standing up. I kept waiting for someone to get out, to step into the light. No one did. The car just sat there, idling quietly in the shadows, no license plates on either end. I didn't stay. I put my car in drive and pulled away from the station as smoothly as I could manage, my hands trembling on the wheel. I didn't speed, didn't want to draw attention if someone really was watching. I took the main road through town, then turned off onto a side street and looped around until I was sure I hadn't been followed. When I finally got home, almost an hour later than I should have, I parked right in front of my porch light and sat there for a long time, engine running, doors locked. I could still see the image in my head. The car sitting there sideways in the road, perfectly placed. No lights, no sound. And that flashlight beam sweeping across my back window at the exact second I moved. The next morning, I drove the same route again in daylight, just to make sure I hadn't imagined it. There was nothing on the road. No tire tracks, no sign of an accident, no car. But near the bend where it had happened, I did notice fresh mud in the ditch. Tracks where a vehicle had pulled through recently. Tracks. I told myself someone must have been trying to set up a fake breakdown or a roadblock to rob passing cars, that I'd just gotten lucky getting away when I did. Maybe whoever it was didn't expect me to react that fast. That's the only explanation that made sense. But what still gets me, even now, is how the same car ended up behind that gas station in Franklin. Same model, same color, same missing plates. Engine running but no driver. I never saw it again after that night. But every time I drive through that stretch near Seneca Rocks after dark, I slow down around that bend without even thinking. I can't help it. That silence in the woods that night, no crickets, no wind, nothing. That's what stays with me, like the whole mountain was holding its breath, waiting for me to stop just a little too long. I started hiking the Art Loeb Trail early that morning, just after sunrise. The sky had that pale, milky blue color that only lasts a few minutes before the sun really wakes up. My plan was to make it up toward Black Balsam Knob by late afternoon, set up camp, and watch the sunset. I'd read that the view up there stretched for miles on a clear day, all soft blue ridges fading into one another. I had my pack strapped tight, my water topped off, and a map folded in the top pocket just in case. It was quiet except for the wind moving through the trees. That low rushing sound that's always there in the mountains if you stop walking long enough to listen. By noon, I was moving steadily, not fast, just enough to keep warm. The trail was narrow in places and wide in others, climbing in and out of rhododendron tunnels and across open ridgelines. The air smelled like wet pine and cold dirt. I ate a protein bar and some nuts when I stopped near a small overlook. Below me I could see layers of forest. Some of it burned in the past, but most of it thick and dark. Everything felt still, but not in a peaceful way. More like the kind of stillness that comes before weather changes. By about 4 in the afternoon, the fog started creeping in. I'd seen it before in the Appalachians, but never this fast. One minute I could see the trail ahead, and the next it was like someone had poured white paint into the trees. It rolled through the branches in waves, swallowing the trail markers and blurring the ridge line. I told myself it was fine, that it would pass. I pulled up my hood and kept walking, following what I thought were the white blazes on the trees. The moisture clung to everything. My pack straps got slick, my hair damp, and the sound of my own breathing started echoing in the fog. After maybe 20 minutes, I realized I hadn't seen a blaze in a while. I slowed down, trying to spot one on the trunks, but they'd vanished. The trees all looked identical, tall, gray, and dripping. I decided to double back. I turned around and retraced my steps, or at least what I thought were my steps. After a few minutes, I still didn't see any markers. I stopped, turned another direction, and went a few paces that way. Same thing. Just fog and trees and that soft hiss of moisture hitting leaves. Then I saw a single footprint in the mud near a small root crossing. My boot tread, at least I thought it was. But when I crouched down and looked closely, I froze. The tread was reversed. The heel was facing uphill, and the toe was pointed back toward the direction I'd come from. It was like someone had stepped backward in my exact print, or like I'd somehow walked in reverse without realizing it. That made no sense, but I remember my stomach dropping anyway. I straightened up and scanned around me. Nothing moved, just white fog pressing between the trunks like slow smoke. I started walking again, faster this time, thinking downhill was safer. Downhill usually means toward water or a road. But the slope kept changing. Sometimes I'd think I was going down, but then the ground tilted back up. I checked my watch and compass. The compass needle spun slightly before settling. It pointed north, but that didn't help much without knowing where exactly I was on the ridge. I didn't have GPS service, just static bars flickering in the corner of the screen. Hours passed like that. The fog never lifted. My legs started aching from constant uneven footing. I stumbled more than once, catching myself on slick roots. The air grew colder as evening came on. Around 8, the light started fading for real, and I knew I had to stop moving before I broke an ankle or walked off a ledge. But something in me kept pushing. That panicked instinct that says, keep going, don't stop yet. I told myself I'd find a clearing, maybe a flat spot near a stream, and set up there. It must have been close to 9 when I saw it, a faint light through the fog ahead, glowing soft orange. I remember my chest tightening in relief. A campfire, I thought. Maybe another hiker or some campers. I stumbled toward it, brushing past branches and wet leaves, squinting as the glow brightened. But when I broke into the small clearing, I froze again. The light wasn't a fire anymore. It was the memory of one, my own campfire ring. The stones blackened and cold, the ashes damp from the fog. I recognized the shape of the log I'd sat on earlier that day, the half-burned stick still lying there. Somehow, I hadn't gone anywhere. All that walking, all that time, and I'd been circling the same ridge. My heart started pounding so hard it felt like it was shaking my ribs. I backed up, trying to figure out how it was possible. I'd walked for hours in one direction. How could I have ended up right back here? I dropped my pack and sat on the wet ground, breathing hard. I thought about hiking through the night, but the fog had turned black and heavy. My headlamp beam only cut through a few feet of it before vanishing into white nothing. I finally decided to stay put. I gathered what dry wood I could find, mostly damp twigs, and tried to light a small fire, but it wouldn't catch. The moisture was too much. My lighter kept sputtering. After a few tries, I gave up and just sat there in the dark. I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag and propped against a rock, knife open in my lap. The silence pressed in thick. I could hear water dripping from the branches and the occasional sigh of wind moving through the fog. Then after a while, something else. Soft shifting sounds like feet dragging through wet leaves. At first I thought it was deer. There were plenty up here, but the sound was uneven, like someone trying to walk quietly and failing. A few steps, then a pause. Another few steps closer. I tightened my grip on the knife. I told myself not to imagine things. The forest does that. It plays tricks when you're tired and scared. I held still and listened. The shifting came from different directions at different times, like the fog itself was moving. Once it stopped right behind the rock where I sat. I could feel my pulse in my throat. I didn't breathe for a full minute. When it finally moved off again, I couldn't tell which way it went. It was just gone. I didn't sleep much. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear the soft swish of wet leaves or a branch snapping in the distance. The fog never cleared, not even by dawn. It just thinned enough to let in some gray light. My clothes were damp, my fingers stiff from the cold. When I stood up, I felt like my body didn't belong to me for a second. My muscles ached, my knees popped. I packed up and forced myself to eat a granola bar, though my stomach was too tight to finish it. When I finally started moving again, I found the white blaze maybe 50 yards uphill from where I'd been sitting all night. Just a single mark, clear as day, shining faintly in the morning light. I don't know how I missed it before. The fog made everything small, like walking in a bubble, and that bubble must have been just big enough to keep me trapped near my own camp. Once I saw that blaze, everything fell back into place. The ridgeline, the slope, even the sound of distant water. I followed the markers slowly, double-checking each one before taking another step. By late morning, the fog broke apart, lifting like a curtain. Sunlight touched the tops of the trees again, and the forest came back to life. I stopped at a small overlook and looked back toward the ridge where I'd spent the night. From up there, I could see how tight the loops of trail wound around it, circling the same area again and again. It would have been easy to walk in circles without realizing it. Still, the memory of that backward footprint never left my mind. Maybe it was just the way the mud had settled. Or maybe I had gotten turned around worse than I thought. When I finally reached Black Balsam Knob later that afternoon, the sky was clear again. I could see for miles, the Blue Ridge stretching out in every direction, calm and endless. But standing there, I didn't feel proud or peaceful like I thought I would. I just felt small. The forest had folded in on me for a night, swallowed me whole, and then quietly let me go. I stayed only long enough to take a breath, and then started back down the trail, checking every white blaze like it was the only thing keeping me in the world.